I'm a new face too. My name is Elise File. I'm a reporter with The Advocate. I joined in June, and I am on the Press Club board now, but it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Procopio today. He is the president of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana, better known as PAR. And while PAR doesn't make any recommendations, it does publish its guide to constitutional amendments that's used by citizens to help inform their votes on these constitutional amendments. And it's been publishing its guide since 1952. So today, Dr. Procopio is going to give us an overview of the constitutional amendments that will be on the March 29th ballot. So let's welcome him.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Someone's asking if I'm going to razzle-dazzle everyone, and basically I don't have enough time for that. We have a whole lot to cover. So real briefly, I'm Dr. Procopio. I'm the president of the Public Affairs Research Council. I'm going to be talking about what's on the March 29th ballot. It is complicated, but it's not so much that it's complicated, it's just a lot. We've been doing guides since 1952. The first guide, back in 1952, and PAR was formed in 1950. This is our 75th anniversary, by the way. Y'all didn't get us a cake, but that's whatever. So we'll deal with that later. So the amendments, there were 34 amendments on the 1952 ballot. So we think we have it hard today. There was 34 amendments that voters had to vote on. And it was 50,000 words in amendments. So it was onerous. So relatively speaking, we have it light. Now our guide to the constitutional amendment, which some of y'all have on the table, but we also released today, is about 24 pages long, which is lengthy, but it's not the longest we've ever put out. There are several other things you can do besides listen today. We have our guide that we just put out. That's online. You can find that on social media or our webpage. We have a one-pager that we also do. You can find. So this is our guide. And then this is just I say one-pager. It's a PAR one-pager, which I mean it's like really back and front. So because we have too much information to hand out. So that's another way to do it. We're also going to have a webinar tomorrow where we'll have people from other organizations. We'll have Jan, who spoke here a while ago. We'll also have the Pelican Institute, and then we also will have Barry Irving. So all of us will sort of talk together along with Melinda about the constitutional amendments, and that'll have several different perspectives on it. So I think that should be helpful. Now, when you amend the Constitution, there are three ways to amend the Louisiana Constitution. You can have sort of just a regular amendment. We're going to change this section of this article. And that's mostly what we see. And three of the amendments on the March 29th ballot are like that. They all have to do with the judiciary. I'm going to talk about those, but very briefly. You can also have a constitutional convention. Thankfully, that is not on the ballot in addition to everything else. You can also rewrite an entire article. And that's what Amendment number 2 does. It rewrites all of Article 7. Even if they change some things and leave some things, the whole article is getting sort of reestablished. So there is a lot there. And look, all of these amendments, whether there's a singular amendment or rewriting of an article, they are all important. We are all making changes to our fundamental governing document. So they all have equal importance. However, George Orwell, we're here, he might say that some of these are more equal than others. So in terms of time, I'm going to spend the first three, I'm going to spend some time on the three judicial amendments, which is Article 5. But then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time on Article 7, which is Amendment number 2. So these are taken a little out of order, but I think I wanted to group them together. All right, that preliminary out of the way. Let's start with the Amendment number 1. This would establish specialty courts, or the right for the legislature to create specialty courts. You can create specialty courts now, but they have to follow or parishes or judicial districts. So you can have, we have a lot of specialty courts. We have 69 specialty courts, most of which are drug courts, but you can have different types. But you can't have, for example, a statewide or regional specialty court. So this would establish the power of the legislature to create specialty courts that are outside of those districts, But it requires a 2/3 vote. The other thing it does is it would essentially reaffirm in the Constitution the right of the Supreme Court to govern and discipline lawyers, particularly out-of-state attorneys. There was an issue with a Houston law firm after Laura and Delta. They launched a lot of lawsuits, some of which people didn't even know they were part of, and so this is a reaction to that. All right, amendment number 3. So we're skipping over 2. There's going to be a lot of discussion about this one. This allows the prosecution of adults, or prosecution of juveniles as adults for felony crimes. That's already allowable, but the way it works, there's 16 crimes listed in Article 5 that where you can have juveniles tried as adults. So everyone 17 is right now you are tried as an adult. So it's below 17 is what we're talking about. And there's 16 crimes. These would be removed from the Constitution, and it would be up to the legislature to establish those, which ones are allowable. So they can add crimes to it, they can take crimes away. It would require a 2/3 vote to do that. So there's a lot of discussion here on whether or not this will probably end up adding additional crimes, although some people make the argument that just about everything that was discussed in committee was already covered under here, and make sure this would only apply to felonies. Right. Amendment number 4. So these are special elections for judicial vacancies. This is not a major change, but essentially what happened when they established the new closed primary system. So we have this very open primary system, everyone would run, and then you would have to run off between the top 2 candidates, often called the jungle primary. So that changed for some races. So that means you might have 3 elections. You might have the first party primary, the runoff in the party primary, and then you'll have the selection between the different primary candidates, so the Democrat, the Republican, and all the various third parties would run. That essentially, in most cases, or in many cases, would add an additional election. So it's hard to get in 2 things, getting that done within a year's time of a vacancy, and also holding them during statewide elections, so congressional elections or other statewide elections. So all of those things together, you either have to go back and change the primary law that says you have to have these votes at these certain dates, or you'd have to have a constitutional amendment to change how Supreme Court justice vacancies are handled. And so this changes it in the Constitution to deal with it, so it doesn't have to get done within 12 months. All right. That was a lot already. So let's move on to Article 7 at a real high level. So this passed overwhelmingly in the November session, the special session. It's a 115-page bill with multiple companion bills to deal with the statutory elements. It really reworks the section that deals with revenues, state budget process, and the various accounts and taxation. And then, even before there was any sort of lawsuit, we needed to warn people that the ballot language doesn't fully account for the scope of the amendment proposal. You are rewriting an entire article of the Constitution. But it's more than that. Article 7 is almost as long as the rest of the Constitution combined. So this is a very weighty article. Now that may mean that so long it probably needs more rewriting, but it certainly becomes difficult. And if we have time, we'll come back to the discussion on the ballot language. Now, you only get 1 vote on this amendment, but if we go to the next one, I broke it down into 6 different categories. So I'm going to go through each one of these. General taxing authority, government growth rate, merger of state savings accounts, the trust fund, they sort of liquidate some trust funds to pay down some debt and then use that savings for teacher pay. A lot of changes to property taxes, particularly the inventory tax, and then there's some other changes to other funds. Again, you may like some of these and not others. You don't vote on these. These are just some categories we put together, I think, to just understand what's going on. So we go to the first one, on general taxing authority. So a couple of things. It doubles the standard deduction for anyone 65 or older. And remember, we already increased the standard deduction as part of regular tax reform that we had in November. It maintains the big 3 sales tax exemption. So food for consumption in the home or groceries, residential utilities, and prescription drugs. Those stay the same. Those are not being removed. It prohibits enactment of a property tax on prescription drugs, which didn't get a lot of discussion. I don't know if someone was going to do that, but essentially this is trying to help with, say, the inventory tax, which we'll talk about later. So if someone has a large manufacturing pharmaceutical plant, you don't have to worry about the inventory tax on that. It prohibits enactment of a new sales tax extension or exemption. Bring that up there. Okay, so any new sales tax exemption has to work for both the state and the local government. So right now we can have an exemption for locals, you have an exemption for the state, you can do it any which way. This would say any new exemptions have to be unified, so they have to apply to both the state and the locals at the same time. And the idea is to help make a sort of more coherent system. Perhaps that might lead to centralization or make that easier, but it doesn't feel good immediately. Lastly, is that it requires a 2/3 legislative vote to enact a new tax exemption exclusion, basically a tax break, to increase the amount of a tax deduction credit or rebate. So right now, and just oversimplifying, it takes a 2/3 vote to raise taxes, which includes getting rid of a rebate or an exemption. And it's a majority vote to lower taxes, which includes adding an exemption. But we've added a lot of exemptions over the years. So now it will take a 2/3 vote to create a new exemption. All right. Still a few more under general taxing authority. There's a maximum rate in the Constitution. This will not actually change the rate. It's going to go from 4.75 to 3.75. It doesn't change the actual rate people will pay. No one will feel this rate. It just puts a different cap, a lower cap on what people, or what the legislature can actually put into law in terms of what they can charge. But remember, this is in conjunction with moving to a flat tax. So the current rate is 3%. So now we'd have a cap. They couldn't increase it to more than 3.75. It removes the minimum cigarette tax and motor vehicle license. Those are in the Constitution. It takes it out of the Constitution, but we will still have these laws. Those are in there for example, the cigarette tax was there because Jindal didn't want it and vetoed it, and this is, by putting it in the Constitution, they could avoid his veto. So that's coming out of the Constitution. It does not come out of law, though. The last two are sort of together. It repeals caps on severance tax. There's a cap on how much severance tax is shared with locals. This will now, that cap will go away, and that will be set by the legislature. So that will probably mean that local governments will get more severance revenue. That's the intent, anyway. All right, switching. Let's talk about the government growth limit. We already have an expenditure limit. So there's an expenditure limit that if there's a surge in revenue, you cannot spend government money above this expenditure limit, or it's state revenue, federal's not included. So that's sort of a hard cap. This will add a softer cap that if you have money above the growth limit, you can spend it, but you can only spend it on non-recurring items. So you're talking about roads and bridges and buildings. Though I will say it's not actually defined what that is. So it's a little bit unsure what's going to be. So you have sort of two limits. So anything below the government growth limit, you can spend like normal. Above the growth limit, you can only spend on non-recurring items. So again, that's not defined. And then you hit the expenditure limit, you can't spend it at all. So this would add a way to slow down, essentially, the growth as the effect. A few more details. So it's going to start in the 26, 27 years, so there's time. A lot of this is also, while it's in the Constitution, a lot of this is, the mechanics of it are in statute, so there's ability to tweak some of this. It's tied to basically the state population and inflation, although it uses a couple of different measures of those. Like I said, you can spend above the growth limit, but you can only spend it on sort of one-time items. Again, that's not defined. All right, the merger of state savings accounts. We have a budget stabilization fund, which was essentially established after the oil boom and bust of the 1980s, that takes, above any kind of base revenue you make from mineral revenue, it takes that and says you cannot spend this. We're going to take that and we're going to put it in the budget stabilization fund, better known as the rainy day fund. And then if we have a shortfall or a natural disaster, we can tap that money to make up the difference. And then recently, in the last several years, we've had a revenue stabilization fund that essentially does the same thing with corporate revenue. This would essentially take a lot of the money from the Revenue Stabilization Fund and put it in the Budget Stabilization Fund. It would go from one of the least funded savings accounts for a state to up in the top 15. However, there would be some money that would be left behind in the Revenue Stabilization Fund for a couple of years. And that money can be used for incentive payments to parishes to get rid of the inventory tax, and also if there's a shortfall in corporate revenue because of all the tax changes, essentially they wanted a hedge. They'd be like, okay, if our numbers don't come out, we need to be able to make sure we don't have a shortfall, and so they're leaving some money in there for those two reasons. So now those, like I said, if you had excess mineral revenue or excess corporate revenue that would flow into these funds, that won't happen anymore. Instead, that money would flow into the general fund, which some degree makes the budget more unstable because you'll now have these sort of larger amounts of revenue flowing into the general fund. The other side, part of that, is that then there won't be money to essentially refill the Budget Stabilization Fund, at least not a lot. There's like a $25 million dedication and also any surplus, 25% of it would have to go into it. And it's going to be very full. So this will be probably fine for 2 or 3 times we have to use it. But after that, there's not going to be a very significant ongoing way of refilling this fund. Okay. Trust fund used for teacher pay. This is probably the one that gets the most conversation because it affects a lot of people. So there are 3 funds that are going to be dissolved. They all are used for education. So essentially it's either K-12 or higher ed or both of them combined. So that money is used for education. In general, they made about $6 to $8 million last year. That can go up or down depending on what investments do, particularly the bond market. The $2 billion stored in that fund, in those funds, those funds will be liquidated. They will be eliminated. The $2 billion will then go to the teachers' retirement system. And so it will pay down their debt. Approximately, it will pay off about a quarter of their debt from about $8 billion and bring it down to about $6 billion. That will free up about $283 million annually. About 208 go to teachers, K-12, and about 75 to higher education. So it'll save about $1 billion in interest payments. And that's because the interest rate on our debt is much higher than the interest rate that these funds were making. And it's a little more complicated than that, but basically. So then that money, the $200 million you see in savings, that will be then used, and it's put in the Constitution, that it has to use for teacher pay raises. Now, quick note, this isn't equal among all the different school districts. Some school districts will actually do much better, and some won't quite have enough money to pay for a $2,000 pay raise. So the administration has said they will help both those districts that are short and charter schools. So that is not in the Constitution. That is something they have just pledged publicly. All right, property taxes, part the first. All right, first most important thing is it maintains the homestead exemption. That's not a change, but it's something everyone cares about, so I mentioned it. A lot of the property tax exemptions, including the industrial tax exemption program, will move to statute, along with a lot of other things, including the millages adjustments, so that's the roll forward, roll back discussion. And then a lot of other property tax exemptions move into statute, and then you require a 2/3 vote to change them, or a 3/4 vote to add another exemption. Things that won't change, things like, there are a couple of other things that don't change, like religious organizations, that is still staying in the Constitution. In fact, they're kind of making a new one just for religious organizations. So property freeze assessment, so if you're over 65 or you're disabled, you get a freeze on your assessment. So it's to kind of deal with inflation with people who's on a fixed income. Those are not being moved to statute as part of this. There's a lot of details in there, but that's an overall part of it. And then also you can only have property tax breaks in fiscal sessions. All right, second section I want to talk about inventory tax. So I have a real rough graphic that we have that lays out how inventory tax works. There is no such thing as inventory tax. It's property tax, and part of that includes inventory, particularly business inventory, or inventory that you're going to resell later. So this is how it works. So businesses pay their property taxes, which includes inventory, to local government. And then, after businesses complained and said, hey, look, this is really non-competitive, there's a lot of places we could go otherwise and not have to pay this tax, The solution was that state government would essentially pay that for them. They would give the businesses a 100% refundable tax credit. And so at that point, the state government was completely paying for local inventory tax. Over time, that has been reduced. So it's now, you don't get the whole amount, and you can only use it in certain circumstances. You can't take ITAP and the credit at the same time. And then coming out of tax reform, this will no longer apply if you're a C corporation. You can't even get the credit then. That's why there's $4 going from business to local government and only $3 in reimbursement. So that's the system. So it's not a very competitive system. It is something that we have. But if you go to the next one, so there's two things that are addressing this. Local governments can eliminate their inventory tax, or the property tax on inventory. It requires the approval of the sheriff, the local school board, and the parish authority. It could be the police jury. And then you get a reimbursement or an incentive from the state that's paid for by the Revenue Stabilization Fund. And it's based upon the past 3 years of how much the local government has made. It's a maximum of $15 million if you do it immediately or at a one time at 2026. Or if you take 5 years, the maximum is $10 million. There's several parishes, about 12 to 14, that make more than that in a year. So for Ascension Parish, they make about $80 million in local revenue just off of inventory tax. So this isn't super, and a great incentive for them. So there is another alternative, is that essentially it will create an additional assessment ratio that exists. We have one for residential property, one for business property, one for utilities. This will add one for business inventory, and then local governments can lower that assessment ratio, essentially kind of cutting the taxes that are there that you have to pay on this. And same thing, it has to be approved by those three groups. So it gives them a middle option that they can deal with. All right, lastly, a lot of other trust fund changes. So there's several funds, about 7 funds that say basically in the Constitution with some changes. We already talked about the Budget Stabilization Fund. There's some other changes that happen, but largely are staying in the Constitution. And then there are 2 sets of funds that get moved to statute but with enhanced protections. So there's permanent trust funds where the principal can't be spent, but the details of what you can spend them on, they have flexibility to change those with a 2/3 vote. And then there's a program funds, which you can see the list of, are essentially like these statutory funds, but you can change them with a 2/3 vote. The other part here is you can change a fund designation with a 2/3 vote, which may be worrying because if you're a permanent trust fund, so for example, the tobacco settlement with Millennium Trust, with a 2/3 vote, you can change it and say, well, that's no longer a permanent trust fund, and then that money might be accessible with another 2/3 vote, which might be troubling. Or it might be good, you think, well good, we need to get our hands on that money and use it more readily. Last thing, and this probably leads into the questions pretty well, is ballot language. As we pointed out, this is the ballot language. There were earlier versions of this that were, and this, I think it's not a secret, this emphasizes among other things sort of the positive aspects of it, and it leaves out a lot of details. I will say the original form of the bill as it was in the House, it was very long. It was probably as long as my forearm. And there were concerns that it maybe couldn't even fit on the entire Secretary of State's screen. So, so you have a balance here what you're trying to do. All I would say, I'm not going to talk about the lawsuit because I'm not an attorney, is I would just double encourage you to try and understand these, share the information, whether it's the PAR guide or someone else's guide, or this program, or we are in a webinar, and share with your friends, neighbors, business colleagues the information that PAR and other organizations puts out, because there's a lot of work and there's a lot of changes being done, and it's very important that everyone understands. So that was a blitzkrieg through the changes. With that, why don't we take some questions? Thank you. Okay.
Since there's so many parts to this, I know they're all germane since they're all tax related and such, but how come this isn't just a set of 6 amendments so it would be easier? Do you know why that's the way it played out?
Well, I guess, so the question is, why is this only 1 amendment as opposed to a series of 6 amendments? And I think the issue, and I don't know for certain, but I think the issue is that there were a lot of things that are Article 7 And I don't know that necessarily 6 amendments would have got there, because they'd all have to be germane. I guess you could say they're all taxing. And so you could have done it that way, but they're also interweave in some ways, so you have some things that are changing the 2 stabilization funds, but you're taking some of that money that's going to fund the property tax changes if that happens. I think you could have done either way. PAR doesn't take a stance on the best way to change the amendments. I mean, that's not what we do. But I think the idea is like, there's so many things we want to change in Article 7, let's just rewrite the whole article. And I say rewrite, not every part gets changed, but make all the changes in one part. Now, whether that's easier or not, that's up to every individual.
And I know PAR very seldom takes stances on things in the legislature, but did you guys work with the legislators on this ballot language, or were you part of that at all?
So the biggest thing we did, we saw, the question is, did we work on this ballot language at all? Early on, we were brought in by the Department of Revenue on the ballot language, actually on several things, on the constitutional amendment, on some of the other tax reform. We did tell them on the earlier version, which I don't think ever became public, that we did think it was a little too biased. And so then they saw the changes that were made, and that was the long version that you got, but then that became a problem. So this is, in some ways, an intermediate response. So it has some, definitely accentuating the positive, but not as bad as it was originally. Okay.
Stephen, I don't think very many people understand the important provision of Article 7, Section 14 that prohibits the use of government money to private enterprise and such. Will that provision be affected by any of the changes in the proposed amendments?
The donations and gifts?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a part of the Constitution, it's a very important part, it says the state, or actually any government, cannot give away money without getting something in return. So you can't make a gift or a donation. That does not change in the Constitution. That, like I said, the whole thing is rewritten legally, but some of the parts still stay in there, and that is one of them. So that was not, I don't think, even discussed. Other questions? My predecessor's predecessor.
Did PAR work with the legislature as far as putting together the plan for big amendment number 2? I mean, did you have input on it?
All right, so this is an important question, and I have to make sure we have full context. So yes, and we wrote in like 2018, we wrote a guide to what we thought Article 7, how it should be changed. And we had a whole committee, and we worked together, we put together things, and we put together a 95-page, a 2-part document that said this is what you got to do when you change the Constitution. And the reason we did it is there were several bills in several years that said we didn't have a Constitution Convention, but they never said what actually should be done. And so we said, well, that's PAR's job. And so we put that out there. And then when we met with Secretary Nelson and his staff, we were going to pitch this to him, our ideas, but he had already sort of taken it and said, handed it to his staff and said, okay, use this as your base as you design a constitutional amendment. So in that sense, yes. However, and this is important, there were various changes along the way. Revenue made some changes, and then the governor's office made changes, and then the House made changes, and then the Senate made a lot of changes, especially at the end. So I want to be really clear, although we had a lot of input into this and tax reform in general, this is not a PAR amendment. There's a lot of good things in here, but it's a lot of things, and I'm trying to emphasize a few of them that we think are problematic. The rainy day fund, for example, not have a funding source is a problem. The ability to get rid of a permanent trust fund of a 2/3 vote, I think, is a problem. And there's lots of other little things. So I don't want anyone to say that PAR is for this amendment just because it has a lot of PAR work in it. Let's see, first down.
Which of these 6 do you believe are the most worthy? And given the fact that you have to vote for the bad along with the good, how does it balance out?
So I want to summarize that by you tried to get me to say what my recommendation was. No, I'm not going to answer that question. Everyone has to be able to figure out, and that is a very hard thing. Basically, there's all these 6 different elements, and that was just the way we summarized them. There's things I didn't even talk about. How do you balance them out? That's everyone's different values, how it fits them personally or their business, plus how they think it's going to make for the state. Those are all different things, and so I really cannot give you that answer. I will say we are having our webinar tomorrow, and we'll have people both from the right and the left, and Barry from Cable, now Leaders for Louisiana, and they will give you their opinion, and so that's probably, those are great sources to kind of hear in a discussion. So, and then we'll have that on our YouTube channel as well. Actually, over here was next.
Are these amendments revenue neutral?
No. Yeah.
So which way does it?
Generally, it won't create more revenue, but it will free up revenue that would otherwise been in the Constitution. It does a lot of things. So for example, those trust funds, the money that would have flowed into the trust funds to set aside money for a rainy day now will go into the general fund. So in that sense, there will be more money to spend, which is a positive. But there also could be a shortfall in the fact that you won't have money going into a rainy day fund. So it's a plus and minus on that one. There are other parts, for example, overall, when I talked about how it's going to take money from education funds, it was throwing up money in investments, but now those will be liquidated, so that won't exist anymore. But it will reduce retirement debt payments, which doesn't add any money, but it reduces a liability, so it frees up the school districts to have more money, but then that will be required to be spent to the extent possible on pay raises. So it's a complicated answer. Generally, the state should have more money to spend for better or worse.
Is there litigation, or may there be litigation on the verbiage that's proposed to show on the ballot?
Yes, so there is a lawsuit. I've read the lawsuit. I don't know what else actually said. So the question is, has there been any litigation on the question of the ballot and the ballot language? And yes, there is a lawsuit, as I've read it, but I don't know where it stands right now, and I certainly can't talk about the chances of it passing or failing in terms of having some sort of effect.
So I am wondering if you're able to just comment on this idea that I've heard regularly since I've been here reporting on the legislature, that Louisiana's Constitution is too long and Article 7 is too long. And can you just maybe speak about the origins of why our Constitution is so long, and share some perspective about that?
I would say, so it's based on, the question is based on observation that our Constitution is too long. It is. Why it's too long. And that goes in combination with the fact that Article 7 is so long. Like I stated earlier, it has grown to, it's about the size of the original Constitution when it was passed in 1974, Article 7 by itself. So why is that? So there's a combination of two factors, and this is not uncommon in a lot of states, particularly southern states, who all kind of changed their constitutions about the same time. Two things. The 74 Constitution is a huge reduction from the 1920 Constitution that we had. So it was a massive reduction. However, it still had a lot of things in it that essentially were statute. A lot of our core tax code and some key elements in there. So anytime you wanted to change something, you had to change it in the Constitution, particularly with property taxes. You know, in the Constitution it says, these are the only exemptions for property taxes, and there shall be no others in statute. Which means if you want to do anything, you had to put it in the Constitution. If you wanted a new one, you want a Constitution. You want to take one out in this Constitution. You wanted to just alter it because there's been a lawsuit on what is in fact property taxes affect people. You had to change it. So a lot of it's coming from that. A lot of it also just mistrust. So we have generally citizens in the United States have pretty low trust in their government. I think in Louisiana it's even lower. So when you don't trust the elected officials, then you want to see stuff in the Constitution. You compare this to our U.S. Constitution. It's, you know, the Louisiana Constitution is a thick book. I have yet to meet too many people that have read the entire thing, and even if they had, you wait a year and they haven't read it unless they keep up with the amendments. Whereas you can read the U.S. Constitution in an afternoon. So it is completely different in terms of the model, where you sort of trust your elected officials to do what's right, for better or worse, or you hamstring your elected officials and say, no, we don't trust you guys, so we're going to lock in what you're going to do. So I think between trust and the fact that there's already so much in there that to make significant changes, you often have to change the Constitution, particularly as it deals with taxes and spending. Let's do this one since you're asking a question.
When you were here last, you talked about needing a little bit more time to digest fully all that was done in the last special session fiscally. When Mr. Yan was here before, he indicated that 2 to 3 years out, the state may face a pretty massive shortfall. Would you concur, and do you have a better grasp now than when you were here before?
Okay, so this question is twofold. It was like, when last time I was here, we had to digest, like, hey, what is the impact of all of the changes, not just the Constitution Amendment, but really the overall tax structure reform that's coming out. And then Jan Mueller, when he was here, pointed out that there's going to be a tax shortfall, I think it's in the 26, 27 year, where there's a dip. Yeah, I mean, that is true. If you look at the REC forecast, there's going to be a dip in that year, and some of that has to do with the shifting of money from the motor vehicle sales tax back over to DOTD. So it's not that the state as a whole will be making less money, it's just how much money goes into the general fund. So it will be a problem. The question is what the legislature will want to do with it. There's a good chance they just undo that and be like, okay, we're not going to let that money flow into the budgets, into the Transportation Trust Fund. We're going to let it just continue to play the general fund, which would be good for the general fund for schools and healthcare, but then you're taking a source of revenue for transportation. There's some other things going on too with corporate revenue as well. So some of it is we still will have to see how this is all affected. It could be, there's a lot of uncertainty based also on what the constitutional amendment's going to do and how that will affect things. It should add some more money for better or worse. Then there's also, how does all the tax revenue still change? I think that is going to take a year or two to really figure out how it's coming in for better or worse. And then you have changes nationally with a new administration coming in, which can make changes. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So things look good for the next year or two, and then we said this cliff, I think that is easily fixable. But it does create another problem on transportation.
Okay.
Well, I think, what you had a question, all right, so I'm gonna let Eddie go.
I hope I'm not out of line, but it might not be the same thing, but what's happened with the diversion canal and all the work we've been doing on the coast, and all of a sudden, they stopped the work.
Okay.
And how much liability are we in the state going to be?
So that is a really good question. The question was have to do what's going on with the diversion and the stoppage of the work on the diversion work that's done as part of the coastal program. I will say that is probably out of bounds for this particular forum, though that is a fantastic question because there are all sort of questions with liability both on the contractor side and the federal government. And then also probably there are other people that would probably need to weigh in on that. That's a bigger question. Y'all ought to find someone to come talk about that. Okay.
Is LSU still going to be listed in the Constitution, and will nursing homes still be a priority?
So will LSU still be listed? They are not removed, as far as I know. So LSU is still listed in the Constitution, though I think, I'm trying to think if that is in Article 7 or not, or if that's in the education. And then the other part is the nursing homes. Yes, nursing homes, they didn't really, for the most part, touch that. So there should be no change to nursing home and the rebasing. I think there were some parts that were looked at, and there might be some minor changes, but basically, that's not really changing.
Non-tax question, not sure if you could speak to this, but I'm just curious if you can share a little bit more knowledge about the genesis of the idea related to discipline for out-of-state lawyers. Are you able,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the idea is, where did the idea, or in fancy words, the genesis of the idea of where the need to have the constitutional change to sort of clarify that the Supreme Court can discipline out-of-state lawyers. Because if you look by rule, the Supreme Court has this ability now, but the question is not in the Constitution. And this really comes from an incident after some hurricanes, I think it was Laura and Delta. And so there was an out-of-state Texas firm that filed, I think, like 1,000 lawsuits on behalf of people in Louisiana. Some of them, the people didn't even know they were having a lawsuit filed in their name. And so there was a lot of allegations of abuse, and that this was not professional conduct. And so I think this is in reaction to that. Now, I can't tell you specifically, does this change substantively? Was this something that was required? Like there's some action that the Supreme Court couldn't take, that they couldn't take in current law? I don't know. It seems like it is just reinforcing this idea, and maybe, and I'm not an attorney, maybe that gives the Supreme Court a stronger hand to dealing with it. But I can't say that's true for certain.
Little early for this, but any thoughts on potential revisions to Medicaid that's being discussed federally?
So federally, okay. So the question was, any potential ideas on changes to Medicaid? I know there has been some discussions. I really couldn't tell you what they're looking at. I mean, some of the ideas that have been kicked around either at the state or national level, and I don't know if these are the ones, but, you know, work requirements, you know, changing. I think there's been some discussion in terms of reducing the amount the state would get. So we have a sliding scale reimbursement schedule depending on how poor your state is. And so what if they just slid it all at a 50-50, so a 1-to-1 reimbursement, which would hurt Louisiana quite a bit. I don't know how much that's actually being discussed, but I know that's something issue I've heard, you know, in the social media sphere. But I couldn't tell you how serious that is. I knew it would be, if it did happen, it would seriously affect Louisiana's budget, but then also would save the federal government money.
I know you said you couldn't determine ahead of time the outcome of the lawsuit on Amendment 2, I believe it is, but if the judge doesn't rule 100% in favor of the legislature, would that then mean that lawmakers have to go back to essentially square one on that particular bill?
So it's a question about the lawsuit and how the judge ruled, will they have to go back to square one? I don't know. I mean, I'm not an attorney, and so I really have no idea what the rulings could be. It could be that you know, the thing is postponed until after the election and then they make a determination. It could be they say you can move forward, but you've got to change the ballot language, but I don't know that the Secretary of State has enough time to do that. I really don't know what the various options are or what even the criteria is for determining is this language out of bounds. I would love to be able to answer that in more specificity, but I am not licensed to practice in the state. And I will get hit with this lawsuit. So. Let's see.
Another question in the lawsuit has the multiple object allegation ever been litigated before? It seems to me that's an obvious sort of problem with this amendment.
Well, so this is the question: has the multiple object ever been litigated? Most objects have, but remember, this isn't an amendment like a normal amendment. You have like a single object. The Constitution allows them to rewrite the entire article. So again, not an attorney, but I think since the Constitution gives them that ability, I think that would overwrite the single object issue.
Time for one more.
Okay, great. Last question.
Over the decades, the state constitution has been updated and added to, and I would say in a way perfected. So
I wouldn't say that.
PAR puts out a definitive book of every representative, every senator, how the bill's done. What percentage of representatives are now in our legislature that ran on a platform that they were going to do these type of changes?
Okay, so with the platform that they would make what, like changes to the Constitution?
Major constitutional changes. I think the average, someone could say the average voter voted for a local representative, but wasn't looking to see all of these changes come at them from this particular legislature.
I couldn't tell you. So we do a guide to the legislature, but we don't poll them in terms of what their major issues, which would be a cool thing to do, but doing this as it is already covered. So I couldn't tell you how many of them are going to come in and make constitutional changes. It's probably at least a few of them, but each race was done. I couldn't give you a sense of the proportion of how many were done, or, you know, every race was different. I think a lot of people were looking at insurance, for example, and crime were sort of some of the bigger issues, and the economy in general. So yeah, I don't think I can fairly answer that question in terms of what people were running on. That was the last question now. So, all right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for having me.